Greetings, fellow traveler. I am the Wanderer, the third keeper of the Sleepkeeper's library, guardian of the paths not taken, and the worlds that might have been. In my section of our timeless library, the books contain not what was, but what could have been. Each volume holds a different thread of history, a moment where fate turned left instead of right, where a single decision reshaped the destiny of nations. I wander through these alternate paths, collecting the stories of worlds that exist in the spaces between possibility and reality. My colleagues, the historian and the myth keeper, tend to their own sacred collections. The historian preserves the forgotten crafts of our world, his archives filled with the voices of master craftsmen and patient hands who built beauty through skill and dedication. The myth keeper guards the stories that shaped civilizations, her collection holding myths that humans whispered for thousands of years, legends that crossed cultures and refused to die, folktales that reveal our deepest fears and greatest hopes. But I am the keeper of the great what if, the wanderer between worlds that might have been. What if Vesuvius had never erupted? What if the Library of Alexandria had survived? What if the Spanish Armada had succeeded? These questions echo through my collection like whispered secrets, each answer creating entire worlds of possibility. Tonight I invite you to walk with me through one such world, a timeline where Mount Vesuvius slumbered peacefully, and the city of Pompeii grew into something magnificent and unexpected. Let me tell you about Marcus Tullius, a garden keeper in New Pompeii, in the year 1479, a city that never died. So settle yourself comfortably, dear listener. Let the sound of these waves carry you to a shore where history turned down a different path, where a mountain's silence allowed a civilization to flourish beyond its wildest Roman dreams. In this world, where the mountain never woke in fury, Pompeii became something beyond Roman imagination. By 1479, it has grown into the jewel of the Mediterranean, a city of learning and gardens, where scholars from across the world come to study in libraries that rival Alexandria at its peak. Marcus Tullius begins his day as the sun rises over the Bay of Naples, painting the peaceful slopes of Vesuvius in shades of gold and amber. He's the keeper of the hanging gardens of New Pompeii, a wonder that makes Babylon's gardens seem modest by comparison. Built into the fertile slopes of the sleeping mountain, these terraces hold plants from every corner of the known world. At 53, Marcus has tended these gardens for nearly 3 decades. His hands bear the gentle scars of his work, small nicks from thorns, calluses from tool handles, stains from plant sap that never quite wash away. But these hands know every plant in his care with the intimacy of a parent knowing their children. The gardens wake with him. The irrigation system, an engineering marvel that combines ancient Roman hydraulics with innovations developed over centuries of peace, begins its morning cycle. Water drawn from Vesuvius's underground springs flows through channels carved from volcanic stone, feeding thousands of plants in a carefully choreographed dance of hydration. Marcus pauses at the first terrace, the Mediterranean garden, where olive trees that are over 500 years old spread their silver-green branches. These trees were young when Pompeii was still a Roman city, and they've grown magnificent in the centuries since, their trunks twisted and thick, bearing witness to a history that never ended in ash and death. He runs his hand along the bark of the oldest tree, feeling the grooves and ridges worn smooth by time. In our timeline, this tree would have burned in an instant, vaporized by pyroclastic flow. But here, it stands as a living monument to continuity, to the beauty of uninterrupted time. The morning air carries the scent of rosemary and thyme from the herb terrace below, mixing with the salt breeze from the harbor. Marcus breathes deeply, appreciating this moment of stillness before the day's work truly begins. From here, he can see the entire city spread out before him, a tapestry of red tile roofs, marble domes, and the tall masts of ships in the harbor. New Pompeii is already stirring. Fishermen return with the night's catch. Merchants open their stalls in the forum. Scholars make their way to the great library, carrying manuscripts and scrolls. This is a city that has had 15 centuries to perfect the art of living well. As Marcus climbs to the upper terraces, he passes through layers of history written in living plants. The hanging gardens were not built all at once, but grew organically over centuries, each generation adding new terraces, new species, new wonders. The lowest terraces date back to the 3rd century, built when Pompeii first began to understand that Vesuvius might never wake. Roman engineers, given the luxury of time and no catastrophe to flee from, created something that was meant to last, and last it did. Marcus knows every inscription carved into the foundation stones. Gaius Petronius Maximus Fecit. Gaius Petronius Maximus made this. The builder's name, preserved for 16 centuries. In our world, that name would have been buried under 20 feet of volcanic ash, forgotten forever. Here, students copy it into their notebooks as they learn the history of their city's architectural evolution. The Fountain of Perpetuity marks the transition between the Roman-era terraces and those built during what they call the Byzantine Renaissance, the period when Pompeii became a major center of learning, drawing scholars from Constantinople, Baghdad, and beyond. The fountain itself is an engineering marvel, fed by the same volcanic springs that still flow warm from deep within Vesuvius. Marcus cups his hands in the fountain and drinks. The water is clean, mineral-rich, tasting faintly of the mountain's depths. Geologists from the university come here to study these springs, trying to understand why this Vesuvius never erupted. Some theorize about different tectonic pressures. Others speak of a different arrangement of magma chambers. Marcus doesn't pretend to understand their theories, but he's grateful for the mountain's peace. He passes a group of botanists from the university sketching specimens in the Eastern Garden. This section holds plants brought back from the Silk Road, species that were traded freely because empires that never fell maintained trade routes that never closed. A pomegranate tree from Persia, chrysanthemums from distant Cathay, jasmine from the kingdoms of India. "Good morning, Master Tullius," one young scholar calls out in accented Latin. She's from the Norse kingdoms, her fair hair braided in the northern style. New Pompeii draws them from everywhere, a city where knowledge has accumulated undisturbed for centuries. Marcus nods and smiles, but doesn't interrupt their work. He remembers being that age, newly arrived in the gardens, overwhelmed by the sheer diversity of life contained in these terraces. His own mentor, old Paolo, had walked him through each section, teaching him not just the names of plants, but their stories, where they came from, who brought them, why they mattered. The Eastern Garden transitions into the New World Terrace, a section that wouldn't exist at all in our timelines, 1479. Here, plants from the Americas grow alongside Mediterranean species. Tomatoes, potatoes, maize, crops that have been feeding New Pompeii for over a century, brought back by explorers who found the Americas in 1367 rather than 1492. In this timeline, the Americas were discovered by a Pompeian expedition, scholars and explorers rather than conquistadors. The exchange was one of knowledge and trade rather than conquest and disease. Marcus tends tobacco plants that came from the Powhatan peoples, each one a reminder that history can unfold with more gentleness than it did in our world. The sun climbs higher, and Marcus begins his primary work, the careful tending that keeps this miracle of biodiversity thriving. Today, he's particularly focused on the newest arrivals, specimens brought by a trade delegation from Mali, seeds that represent years of diplomatic exchange. He kneels in the soil, volcanic soil, ironically, enriched by the same mountain that killed Pompeii in our world. Here, that volcanic fertility has been a blessing for over 1,000 years, producing gardens of unprecedented richness. Marcus's fingers work the earth, checking its moisture, its texture, its readiness to receive these precious seeds. Each seed is wrapped in silk, protected for the long journey across the Mediterranean. Marcus unwraps them with the care of someone handling religious relics. In a way, they are relics, living connections between distant cultures, proof that different worlds can meet peacefully and exchange their treasures. The baobab seeds must be scarified before planting, he murmurs to himself, a habit developed from years of working alone. Chip the outer coating. Soak overnight in warm water from the volcanic springs. Plant at dawn when the soil is cool. His knowledge comes from many sources. The Malian delegation brought detailed instructions, written in Arabic script. The university library holds botanical treatises from scholars across the Mediterranean and beyond. And his own experience, accumulated over decades, tells him how to adapt these instructions to Pompeii's unique microclimate. This is what makes the Hanging Gardens possible, not just the engineering and the volcanic soil, but the accumulated knowledge of centuries of peaceful exchange, books that were never burned, scholars who never fled invading armies, trade routes that never closed because empires evolved rather than collapsed. As the morning progresses, Marcus moves through his rounds. He checks the irrigation channels, clearing a blockage here, adjusting a flow rate there. He examines plants for signs of pest damage or disease. He makes notes in his log, detailed observations that will be added to the garden's archives, another layer in the accumulated wisdom of this place. In the citrus grove, he finds what he's looking for, the first blossoms on the trees brought from Cathay last spring. The delicate white flowers fill the air with perfume, and Marcus allows himself a moment of pure satisfaction. These trees weren't supposed to thrive this far from their homeland, but careful attention, the right soil, the perfect microclimate, they've adapted, they've found a home. A bell chimes from the city below. The third hour. The great library is fully open now, and Marcus knows that within an hour, students will begin arriving at the gardens for their botanical lessons. The hanging gardens aren't just a showcase of beauty. They're a living classroom, a research station, a repository of the world's botanical diversity. He makes his way to the teaching terrace, where he'll spend the afternoon with students from the university. This is perhaps his favorite part of the work, passing on knowledge, ensuring that what he's learned won't be lost. In a city that has survived for 15 centuries beyond its historical death date, everyone understands the importance of preservation, of continuity of teaching the next generation. But first, a few more hours of quiet work. Marcus returns to the highest terrace, where the most delicate specimens live, plants that require constant attention, that represent the pinnacle of the garden's achievement. Here, an orchid from the jungles of the Maya peoples grows beside a rare lotus from the kingdom of Siam. Both are thriving, impossibly far from home, cared for by patient hands in a city that history forgot to destroy. The morning light shifts toward noon, golden and warm, but never scorching. The sea breeze keeps everything temperate, perfect for these sensitive species. Marcus works methodically, lost in the rhythm of his tasks, in the meditation of careful tending. His breathing synchronizes with his movements. Check the moisture, adjust the shade cloth, examine the new growth, make a note. There's a timelessness to this work that Marcus has always found deeply satisfying. The same actions, performed with the same care, day after day, season after season, year after year, but never boring, because each plant is different. Each day brings new challenges, new discoveries, new reasons to pay attention. As the afternoon deepens, Marcus's work takes on an even more meditative quality. The urgency of morning tasks has passed, and now there's only the gentle maintenance of things that are already thriving. A leaf to prune here, a notation to make there, small adjustments to keep everything in balance. The students have come and gone, full of questions and enthusiasm. Marcus answered them patiently, showed them how to identify different species, explained the delicate balance required to keep plants from such different climates growing side by side. Now, as the sun begins its slow descent towards the western horizon, the gardens are quiet again. He sits for a moment on one of the ancient benches, worn smooth by centuries of garden keepers who came before him. From here, the view is magnificent. The city spread below, the harbor full of ships from every corner of the known world, Mount Vesuvius rising peacefully in the background, its slopes green and gentle. The lighthouse at the harbor begins to prepare for evening, though darkness is still hours away. Marcus watches the keeper, climbing the spiral stairs, a tiny figure against the white stone. That lighthouse has stood for over 1,000 years, guiding ships safely to port, its light never interrupted by catastrophe or war. There's something deeply peaceful about this moment. The work done, the gardens thriving, the city humming with quiet life below. In worlds that followed different paths, Pompeii might have become something else. But here, in this particular thread of possibility, it became exactly what it needed to be: a place of learning, beauty, and peace. The light continues to soften, and the gardens settle into their evening rhythms. Night-blooming flowers begin to prepare for their time, folding back the defenses they held against the day. Diurnal birds give way to nocturnal ones. The temperature drops slightly, pleasantly, as it always does this close to the sea. Marcus will stay a while longer, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. But for now, let your eyes rest. Let the sound of these waves carry you deeper into possibility, into the peaceful darkness where alternate timelines bloom like the night flowers of new Pompeii. In the darkness of evening, the hanging gardens take on a different character. Marcus lights the oil lamps along the main paths, a tradition dating back to Roman times, continued without interruption for over a millennium. The flames flicker gently, creating dancing shadows among the leaves. The night-blooming cereus unfurls its petals in slow motion, releasing a fragrance that has traveled across oceans and centuries to bloom here on this peaceful mountainside. Marcus checks on it regularly through the night, noting the exact timing of its flowering in the endless records of the gardens. In the scholars' section of the gardens, candles burn in reading alcoves. Even at this hour, students pore over botanical texts, their dedication to learning uninterrupted by the turn of the sun. This is what Pompeii became in this timeline, a city where the pursuit of knowledge never sleeps, never ends, never burns. The volcanic springs that feed the gardens flow constantly, their warmth never varying. Deep beneath the earth, the same forces that destroyed Pompeii in our world here provide only gentle warmth, mineral-rich water, and soil of unparalleled fertility. A different arrangement of stone and fire, allowing life instead of bringing death. Marcus makes his evening rounds, checking on the most delicate specimens, the orchids from the tropics, the alpine flowers from distant mountains, the desert plants that require precise amounts of water despite being surrounded by Mediterranean abundance. Each one represents a small miracle of adaptation, of finding ways to thrive far from home. The lighthouse beam sweeps across the gardens every 30 seconds, a regular rhythm that marks the passing of time. Marcus has learned to work by it, timing his tasks to its rotations. 30 seconds to examine one plant, 30 seconds to move to the next. An endless cycle of care measured by light across darkness. In the ancient olive grove, trees that predate the Roman Empire rustle their leaves in the night breeze. They've grown so slowly, so patiently, adding rings year after year without interruption. Some are hollow now, their centers rotted away by age, but still they live. Still they bear fruit. Still they stand as witnesses to centuries of peace. The harbor below is quiet now, most ships secured for the night. But trade never completely stops in New Pompeii. Somewhere a night market operates for sailors from distant ports whose schedules don't match the local day. Merchants from the sunset kingdoms exchange goods with traders from the dawn lands, speaking in the polyglot mix of languages that serves as the city's common tongue. In the library of accumulated wisdom, the night scholars work by candlelight, copying manuscripts, comparing texts, adding marginalia that future generations will study. The library's collection spans 15 uninterrupted centuries. No fires, no book burnings, no conquerors torching knowledge. Just careful hands copying, preserving, expanding. Marcus pauses by the fountain of perpetuity, listening to water that has flowed without cease for over 1,000 years. Students come here to reflect, to think, to let the sound of endless water wash away the day's concerns. Some say the fountain grants inspiration. Marcus thinks it simply reminds us that some things tended carefully need never end. The night air carries sounds from across the city. A distant flute playing in the artist's quarter. Voices singing in harmony from the temple of the muses, the soft clatter of dishes from late-night taverns. This is a city that has perfected the art of civilization, that has had centuries to learn how people can live together in harmony. In the Garden of Lost Inventions, plants that were never cultivated because technology took different paths grow in careful rows. Steam roses that might have powered a different industrial revolution. Clockwork vines whose seeds contain natural gears. Marcus tends them carefully, these remnants of technologies that this peaceful timeline never needed. The stars wheel overhead, the same constellations that astronomers in our timeline chart, but seen from a city that shouldn't exist. Marcus knows some of the star names in a dozen languages. The Arab names, the Chinese names, the names given by peoples from the Americas. All of them studied here, all of them welcome, all of them adding to the accumulated knowledge of centuries. As midnight approaches, Marcus completes his final rounds. Everything is secure, everything is thriving. The gardens will wake with the dawn, just as they have for over 1,500 years. Some cycles are simply meant to continue, unbroken by catastrophe, sustained by careful hands and patient hearts. As I close this volume and return it carefully to my shelves, I find myself lingering over questions that have no simple answers. What separates the world that was from the world that might have been? A few degrees in the magma chamber's pressure? A different arrangement of tectonic forces deep beneath the earth? Such small things to mean the difference between a city buried in ash and a civilization that flowered for 15 centuries. I often wonder what my colleague, the historian, would say about the real Pompeii that existed in our timeline, the city frozen in a single catastrophic moment, preserved under ash for centuries. In his archives, he holds the memory of what actually was, the suddenness of the eruption, the tragedy of lives stopped mid-breath. The real Pompeii tells us much about Roman life precisely because it ended so abruptly, preserving a moment in time like an insect in amber. Would we trade those archaeological treasures for the accumulated wisdom of an unbroken tradition? There's no easy answer. And the Mythkeeper. I imagine her collection contains myths about mountains that wake and speak, about volcanic gods who demanded sacrifice or brought fertility to the land. Perhaps she guards stories of Vulcan himself, the Roman god of fire and forge, and the legends people told to make sense of the explosive power beneath their feet. She understands that humans have always created stories to explain the forces we cannot control, to find meaning in both catastrophe and blessing. But here in my collection of alternate paths, I preserve a different kind of hope, the hope that sometimes the catastrophe simply doesn't come, that a mountain can sleep peacefully for millennia, that a city can grow without interruption, accumulating wisdom, welcoming strangers, perfecting the art of civilization. That history doesn't have to be written in blood and ash, that there are timelines where patience and learning triumph over conquest and catastrophe. If you found comfort in walking these peaceful gardens with me tonight, I invite you to return. Each week, I'll be here in my section of the library, opening another volume, wandering down another path that history didn't take. There are infinite possibilities waiting in these shelves, infinite worlds where a single choice led somewhere beautiful and unexpected. The lighthouse beam sweeps across the water one more time, guiding ships to safe harbor as it has for centuries in this timeline where everything went right. And somewhere in the gentle darkness, Marcus Tullius tends his impossible gardens, where plants from worlds that never were grow side by side under the shadow of a mountain that never woke. Rest well, fellow wanderer, until we meet again among the worlds that might have been.